Hello, I'm Séverine Mathieu. I'm a sociologist and I'm a full professor at the École pratique des hautes études. And I'm working about a question of reproductive rights, bioethical laws, and I'm collaborating to the cycle for the last 5 years. This is the second session of acting in time of crisis of the 2024 cycle. This year, we decided to focus on how do conflict ends. And for this session, we have the pleasure to receive two personalities, Mark Freeman and Alberto FERGUSSON. And just to introduce them very briefly, because they will complete their own presentation. Mark Freeman is a founder and executive director of the Institute for Integrated Transition. And so he's a leading expert in political transitions and high-level peace negotiation with more than 30 years. And so he has moved in several countries as Ukraine, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, Tunisia. I just quote some of them. And just to conclude, Mr. Freeman is a member of the International Panel of Experts and the International Commission on Missing Persons, and an advisor to the Schmidt Futures International Strategy Forum. So thank you for joining us today, Mark. And Alberto FERGUSSON is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and you're working in Colombia, and you work also in the US. In 1982, you founded the Institute of Accompanied Autoanalysis, and you're an advocate of the human rights of the so-called mentally ill. And you developed something very interesting, I think, called accompanied self-rehabilitation, what is also called accompanied autoanalysis. And it's a unique alternative to traditional psychiatric treatments. You're the founder of Fungrata in Colombia and FIAS in Washington, D.C. Those are innovative institutions that develop therapeutic strategies to accompany so-called mentally ill people. And you're full professor at the Universidad of Rosario in Colombia. And there you have created the Center for Psychosocial Studies. So thank you very much, Alberto, to join us today. So I'll let Sadi complete this introduction, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Séverine, for these introductions. And so we have two very, very prominent experts of negotiations and who have been involved in many, many of those. And we thought, because both of them also have been connected to especially the peace processes in Colombia. And it turns out that Dr. Paulius Yamin, who is the scientific director of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, was actually in the government during the peace process. And we thought that just a little bit of his experience could be an interesting start of the discussion. So Paulius, if you perhaps can tell us about how you saw it from the perspective of the Colombian government inside.
Thank you, Sadi. So thank you so much, Alberto and Mark, for joining us. I am Paulius. I am the scientific director here at the Institute. I am from Colombia. Before focusing more on the topics that I work in now, which are around behavioral change and for development and social norms and these things, I worked with Antanas Mokus for a few years, and then with people that had been close to him, including during the Santos government. I worked for 2 years with the administrative department for the public function, with the director there on cultural change and behavioral change topics, but we had in charge a very interesting part, which was the pedagogy of the peace process to the public servants of the government. And maybe we can speak a little bit about that later. We thought maybe it was a good way to introduce this talk, which we will have, with a small story from when I used to work in the Santos government during the negotiation with the FARC in Colombia. which basically shows a little bit the different levels of representations and ideas that are built around a peace process, and how challenging it is to put the perspectives together, in a sense, if that is even possible. So when I was working in the government, we were in the ministry in charge of doing what was called the pedagogy of the peace process for the public servants before the peace was signed, and after as well. It was basically an effort to try to explain the peace process and the agreements to the public servants of the government. In Colombia, there are more than 1 million public servants, if you count the army and the teachers. And then the challenge there was basically one in which you would take discourses and pedagogical materials that the government had, to try to explain it to their own employees, which had very diverse perspectives and personal experiences. So you would go with your nice materials and your nice ideas about the country and how it will be more peaceful and so on. And people will tell very hard personal stories about how they lost a family member, how a family member was taken away by the group, and so on. So the idea we would like to start today with is how can we manage those different perspectives? Is it worth to manage, and until where? So could you maybe Mark comment first?
Great. Well, thank you, Paulius, and thank you for the invitation to this conversation. I'm Canadian by origin and trained mostly as a human rights lawyer, international lawyer. And many decades ago now, so this probably starting in the 1990s, I became very interested in how expectations of justice were managed within peace processes. I ended up doing a fair amount of advisory work, a bit like Alberto, I think. My case across many different countries, advising different parties, sometimes the negotiators, sometimes civil society groups, sometimes governments, on how to manage expectations realistically of justice within a peace process. And so that led me to write and advise on issues like amnesty. And I would say particularly in the last 10 years, I mean, it was about 10 years ago now that I founded the institute that I currently direct, the Institute for Integrated Transitions. And we work, I would say, on the nexus between negotiation and transition, ensuring that the two work well together, let's say, that a negotiation serves a transition. And to that end, I mean, our institute has about 330 experts in different parts of the world, quite a lot of them in Colombia because it was such an important case. And I guess I should also mention that one of the privileges I had in this period of these last 10 years was to be an advisor in Havana on exactly this issue that I mentioned. It was what's called the victims chapter. So for 18 months, I was the international advisor to the Colombian government delegation on that issue within the larger peace negotiations with the FARC. I suppose I'll just make maybe a few initial comments or reactions to what you just shared. I suppose the first is that pedagogy, in the way you described it, I think is much harder to achieve even with people who are presumed to be on your side, presumed to be in favor of peace. it's a very difficult thing to achieve methodologically. It very much succeeds or fails on the basis of who is doing the selling or the pedagogy or the teaching. In my experience, in whether it's whether we're talking about pedagogy within one side, there has to be a pedagogy to the people who are on one side of the actual official negotiation. And then there's, of course, a pedagogy to the society on the outside of the whole process. And I suppose a simple lesson from my experience is that in general, it's best to identify who are the most trusted messengers or teachers or sellers or sources. That will have a determinative factor on the receptivity of those who are meant to be the subjects of your pedagogy. It's a basic lesson, but it's not followed very often in my experience. So that's one reflection. Secondly, I would say that in most cases where you're talking about a context of violent conflict, most likely there's a very high state of polarization in society. So if the content is, if the methodology is too technocratic, if it seems obvious, like how would anyone, disagree with peace, or why would anyone, oppose the end of a long, violent armed conflict? Well, in fact, many will see it as treason, giving away the state. You're not working from, I would say, if you approach the topic too technocratically, in my experience, and not politically, meaning that you have a political sensitivity to how you do pedagogy, you may be wasting a lot of time and resources, because probably a better starting point, a more realistic starting point, is that a lot of the people who you'll be talking to, selling to, teaching to, are at the very best quite skeptical, and in many cases quite hostile to the whole initiative. So you have to be pretty sophisticated, I would say, because polarization is probably the rule, not the exception. I would say, closed minds is probably the rule, not the exception, when you're at the beginning of a pedagogy process. Maybe those are two initial quick reactions.
I'm a physician, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst by training. That's how I began my career several years ago. Let's say that besides, I'm a professor at Rosario University in Bogota, Colombia. I am the director of the Center for Psychosocial Studies at that university. Let's say I've divided my life in three different paths. I've had a clinical practice for many years. I would say that the main thing I've done in that area is to work for many years with homeless, mentally ill people, mainly people diagnosed with severe psychosis. I've been a professor at the university all my life, and I've always been kind of involved in the peace process. This began many years in Colombia. This began many years ago, initially with President Santos. Many years before he was a president, I worked with him, kind of crafting and imagining all the peace process that later happened with the FARC. I was kind of in the shadows in all this for many years, including during the process with the FARC. During the process with the ELN, I was more visible. I was part of the government delegation in the talks with the ELN, the initial talks with the ELN during President Santos, those that happened in Quito and then in Cuba. I've continued to be part of all that process. I've gone again into the shadows during the current process with President Petro. I've been in touch with the group and with Oti Patiño and all the people, but again, more in the shadows. I was, for 3 years, I was very active in the Truth Commission in Colombia, which was a nice thing to integrate all that had happened before. And I'm very happy to be in this conversation today. Thank you, Paulius, and thank you, Sari, for inviting us. Besides agreeing with Mark in what he said, the only thing I would add is that while thinking about pedagogy, it's very important to really be careful and have a humble approach to it, because when you say pedagogy, you kind of imply there's someone there, or a group that's understanding what's going on, and another group that doesn't understand. So that's something you have to be very careful, because in this type of topic, you're very frequently surprised by both things, by both extremes, that some people that you would assume understand and have a high level of understanding of what's going on, and others don't, and you're surprised by both. You find people who you think would not understand that are really those who understand it in a beautiful way, in a much better way than those who are supposed to be teaching and doing the pedagogy. So one of the most important things, and that's the only point I would add, is when you begin this process of pedagogy, you have to be really open to identify people within the community whom you would never have thought had such clarity on what's going on in the process, and then have a system that would allow them to be the ones who are going to do part of the pedagogy from there on. So you're always looking for people who should do the pedagogy and the explaining and the sharing the understanding of what's going on in the conflict and in the negotiation and in the process.
I'm struck at how, in a way, humble and open your style is when you talk about these things, as it's not that the people who are in charge of monitoring the process would know better, but it's in a way those participants would have to do the thing themselves, and you're more helping them to do that. I was struck by what Mark said about this thing about how it's internal discussions and gradual pedagogy or selling or whatever. How is this something that goes with the whole process, or is this progressive?
Thanks, Sadi. I mean, the picture of a negotiation from the outside, in the imagination of most people, quite understandably, is that the vast majority of time that the negotiators or mediators are spending is around the negotiation table in very acrimonious discussions, trying to reach a settlement. When, in my experience, the vast majority of time of those exact people, the negotiators and the mediators and everybody involved on the inside of a process, the vast majority of their time is spent is negotiating internally, strengthening or protecting the mandate of the negotiation, clarifying, what might be red lines not to cross, trying to have discussions about what the other side of the negotiation might be expecting or might be seeking. Most of the time, in short, is in a whole series of internal negotiations. So I'll let Alberto say more. He's had lots of experience in this kind of work as well.
That's certainly a very important point, Mark. And I would just add that the internal negotiation that happens is not only internal within each group and each delegation in each political party. It's also within each person. No, a negotiations has to an internal self-negotiation has to happen in the process. And in my view, and for what I saw and I experienced, the best negotiators are those who really have the capacity to negotiate with themselves, no, and to change their point of view, no, really have a dialogue. Of course, having a dialogue for this purpose of this conversation means, if you're going to have a dialogue, it means that you're willing to change your initial position. If you're not willing to do that, you're not entering a dialogue. The only possibility for a real dialogue to happen is if you're really willing to listen and to change your initial position. But that's especially true with your own internal dialogue and with your own internal position. So these processes of negotiation they move in a much better way when you have people who have this capacity to change their minds and to really see a different perspective and complete their view and understand that not only they, at the best, they just had part of the truth, but the only possibility to really understand is to change and to listen to others. So that's and I agree that this is a kind of all sorts of negotiations in different levels, but I would like to emphasize, because that's something we have understood recently in our group, at least, how important it is to develop this capacity to negotiate with yourself, no, in the process, and to change your own point of view.
I was wondering if this process of change within or together is something that can go step by step, because I've understood that this is the kind of new approach that you have been developing.
Yes, it's well, it of course, as it always happens, in many ways it's old, and many people said it before, but the emphasis on that is kind of new, at least in our group. I think that makes the difference. No, a group that's willing to change. Before a group, delegation, society, if there's not a willing to change and to see new perspectives, it's very difficult to really evolve. No, that's the only possibility to move ahead, especially handling all the emotions, because we hadn't said that, but of course, many people think that negotiations is a kind of an intellectual effort, which of course it is up to a certain point, but the same that Mark was saying, that a big percentage of the time you will spend on negotiations within your own group and within yourself, I would say, it's also true that you spend a huge percentage of your time dealing with your own emotions during the negotiation, during the process, and dealing with the emotion of the others, and not only with the arguments. It's not a festival of arguments. It's a festival of emotions, no? And every now and then you have an argument, no? But it's really full of emotions, and you have to make the emotions part of the process to kind of cope with them, to create a safe haven for the emotions that develop, and then that also allows the things to move forward. We usually don't think that there are risks in negotiation, and I'm going to talk about one big risk, and the big risk is that all that we are talking about in a negotiation has to do with social conflicts, which processes that are happening, and they need some time to move forward, to resolve, if that's the word, to end. They need some time, no? So the problem with the methodologies that have been developed for negotiations is that sometimes they're too effective, no? And they are able to convince the other of something that probably was not the best idea and was premature, let's say. So there are also risks in going too slow, but also risks in going too too fast. And that's going to be one of my questions to Mark, because his group is thinking a lot about the fast track. No, so I agree with that, and I love the idea of developing that. But there could be a risk in the fast track to have some successes and meet goals prematurely. Prematurely meaning that we are humans, and this is a society, and humans and societies need time to move forward. No, so it's interesting. I always give an example, and it's my responsibility. I'm not saying that any other person thinks about that, but I always give the example when I'm talking about this, that in the Colombian case, in some way, the Colombian delegation, the government delegation, was successful too early in convincing the FARC to hand over the weapons. You know, in the opinion of some of us, that was premature. No, and that should have taken place a bit further on in the process, just as an example.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to conclude?
Sure. No, it's very interesting to listen to Alberto's comments. Maybe I'll try and be a little bit both responsive to what he said, but also a little bit devil's advocate. I think that the model we have of negotiation is based, the one we have today, which has a whole set of principles, the version of negotiation that would be taught in universities, the version of negotiation that exists in global and regional guidelines. If you look at all the principles, they're quite idealistic for the most part, and they produce a negotiation process that is very slow. And I think for some conflicts, you have conditions of ripeness for negotiation that maybe give you the luxury of time. Time is a little bit more on your side because maybe there are structural conditions in terms of the balance of power between the parties to the conflict, or the politics in the country. It's a new government that's elected, or, you know, you could have a lot of favorable things. But my doubt, I suppose, is in looking at the record of success of the idealistic slow model that dominates. First of all, the vast majority of conflicts that I see and that my organization works on have a level of urgency that the slow idealistic model simply is a mismatch for. It simply doesn't, it's not possible, because a negotiation in most of the conflicts I know will not produce a sort of container effect or calming effect on the conflict. It actually produces a lot of new anxiety and new spoilers, and in some cases, increases in conflict. And there isn't time. Time is short, actually, for trying to produce a negotiated outcome. And so what Alberto was inviting me to share, what he referred to as the fast track model, is something that doesn't exist yet, but something that I believe needs to exist, and needs to exist urgently, because the slow idealistic model, we need it. We need models that are premised on the goals of a transformed individual. I mean, I like the point you made, Alberto, about it's not just the group, it's also the individual that needs to transform. But I suppose in the spirit of being a devil's advocate, I guess I would ask or invite a reflection on whether negotiations generally need to be a lot faster. I think the transition individually, collectively, probably can move more slowly. But as the longer the negotiation goes, in my view, the greater the level of anxiety that is produced, the more conflict that accompanies that anxiety, the more polarization, in fact, that also grows. In other words, time is a major factor that if you don't manage time well, if things move too slowly, you may not even know it, but you could easily be moving backwards. The problem could be getting worse. In fact, it often is. And we also need at least an additional model that is built for speed, that takes the factor of time far more seriously. And as I said, not least because it is an objective reality that in most conflicts, there is a genuine objective urgency to produce some kind of outcome. Will it be transformative? If it's fast, probably not. Will it have risks? If it's fast and more transactional, perhaps, in the methodology, absolutely. But maybe a piecemeal approach is something that we should be following in a much greater percentage of cases. And I say that again because it's hard to see how the idealistic slow model is something that we can rely on to the degree that we are today. It's a dominant, exclusive paradigm about the correct way to negotiate. And its slowness is itself a major, major problem for the possibility of negotiated outcomes. And let's not forget, the point of negotiating, at least one simple point, is to produce an outcome. It is not negotiation for negotiation's sake. If you don't get to an outcome fast enough, many times, you don't get to an outcome at all. And then there's really nothing to sustain or to transform. It's just a story of failure.
But could you give us an example of what's a piecemeal approach? Is that like getting a ceasefire, or what would be such steps? That I understand that doing this lowers the level of conflict and then puts less pressure on the negotiation, etc. And it's probably a good spiral. But what examples?
Well, there'd be different. I mean, a fast track model would require principles that would make any modern negotiator uncomfortable because they go against the paradigm. So the agenda should indeed be short in general as a rule for fast track negotiation. It might just be one item, a local ceasefire that doesn't resolve the conflict, but reduces or reshapes the conflict. It's a stepping stone or a building block. It has to be implemented carefully. It will definitely involve risks, but short agenda would be a principle that would logically inform a fast track model. Who would participate in the process? In the modern paradigm of the correct way to negotiate, everybody should be involved. Absolutely everybody. Extremely broad participation. In a fast track logic, it would be more a principle of inclusive enough logic, inclusive enough to produce an outcome. So that would be an example of, again, a principle that would logically inform a fast track approach. And just as there's a whole set of principles that, again, have to be developed in a fast track model for it to have to be realistic, to actually produce outcomes. But there's a distinction, and that probably you're all familiar with, but it's a distinction by a Scandinavian academic who recently passed away, Johan Galtung, who contrasts positive peace and negative peace. The negotiation model we have today, the paradigm, is built on ideals of positive peace, which is like heaven on earth, right? So positive peace is full rights, equality, there's no conflict, etc. By contrast, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that we also need a model of negotiation that has the objective of negative peace, as he calls it, which is simply the absence of violence. It's definitely not heaven on earth, but it's the absence of violence as it's a foundation, it's a building block for a lot of the other goals that a society may have. And a fast track model would have the logic of negative peace, which in my view is quite positive. a lot of societies would be very happy to have negative peace as opposed to the total absence of any form of peace, which is what many societies experience today.
I really appreciate, Mark, you're bringing this concept of speed and of the which is implied in the fast track. I think that's a very important point, and also this point about the negative peace. Until we wait for what's coming on from your group, I'm really looking forward to that. I would like to maybe we have to introduce the issue of speed in negotiations. There's no discussion, and I think that's a very important contribution you're making, Mark, that speed is a very important piece of all the whole process and something we have to think about. As of now, probably I would feel better to say we have to find which is the right speed, right? Sometimes faster than others, and be open to understand that there are moments in which the process needs to go faster, slower. And it's interesting because you certainly know this understanding as you do the American and the French culture. This reminds me of the slow food and fast food kind of discussion, right? So it's interesting because it's the right speed, not necessarily. So I think it's a very important contribution, no? And something that you're right. Sometimes not solving or not reaching fast enough, right, can increase the conflict. But also increasing a conflict is not necessarily a bad thing, no? We know that sometimes conflicts have to increase before they are solved, no? And we all know, of course, that one of the things that keeps conflicts from moving on and from resolving is war, no? War, and that's why we all know that post-conflict has to do with increasing of conflicts, no? And we are looking for the post-conflict, but we know that the post-conflict means bigger conflict and more complicated things happening because the war kind of puts things down in a way that's not good because the process is not moving ahead. So I think it's a very important point that you're bringing, and it's something that probably you don't have to decide exactly what's the rhythm, but I would have no doubt that your contribution is always think about what's the right speed, no, in analyzing any special situation, and that can change and that can vary from one process and from one moment of a process to another.
Well, thank you for that, Alberto. And indeed, I suppose that the thing is, if you're negotiating, the conflict isn't waiting for you. It's shaping, it's moving forward. I think it's a more realistic assumption, perhaps, in terms of the speed factor, that when you have started a negotiation, I think there is an assumption in the model we have. I don't know if you would agree, but I think there is an assumption in the model that we have is that the generation of a negotiation space, when the society, when the world knows that the parties to whatever the conflict is, that they're sitting down and they're negotiating, that will have a calming effect or a moderating effect on the conflict itself. I think that's an assumption that rarely is borne out in reality. As I said, I think a lot more anxiety gets produced, more conflict gets produced, and so I think, in short, that I think you're right. The thinking about speed, we have to be careful. We have to think about, sometimes some things need to move slow, sometimes things need to move more quickly. I like the way that you put that. And that's what I hope will come out of the fast track model is, I think, just a proper and overdue attention to and a sort of underestimation of the speed factor, because we have to somehow, in a sense, it's a sort of better balance between idealism and realism that I think we need to have in negotiation. And we've tilted very far over to idealism, and it's a great concern to me.
But then, you know, there's something that usually comes when you see the negotiations from the outside, is that the importance of truth and justice in the resolution, that we get a better resolution. But when I hear you speaking, I hear something much more transactional and less, in a way, rational, but more about emotions, and whether it's fair or not seems to be less important than how it makes the process go forward. So how important are truth and justice efforts in the resolution of conflicts?
I'll be quick, and Mark will have many more things to say on that. Before that, when I read the title, How Do Conflicts End? I thought, okay, I don't feel comfortable with the title, but I know that what the title means. You're not exactly hoping that conflicts end, no, because that's equivalent to death. No, I mean, the only thing in humans, in society, the end of conflicts is the end of the end. No, so I'm sure what you mean is how to end the violence, probably, right? And but that's important to make that difference in language, you know, and then we can agree up. And not only violence, but certain sort of language violence, no, like armed language violence. So that. I'm sorry, but Sari, I began to answer another thing. I forgot your question. What was that? Yes.
That was about the importance of justice and truth.
Oh yeah, very quickly. Yeah. No doubt, a huge importance. I mean, what I learned in my experience in the Truth Commission is that it's without truth, it's impossible to solve conflicts, to reach peace. But again, the speed is very important. No, truth is not something that you can force into people. That's my lesson learned in the Truth Commission. You cannot just kind of give the truth in any way suddenly, lots of truth to people, because there's a process through which you have to process the truth you're listening to. You have to give time to process that as a individually and as a society. The society needs time and needs a system, needs a way to share. There, it's you have to do a lot of pedagogy again. How do you share the truth? How do you communicate the truth? In what words? Who does it? As Mark was saying in the other sense, and in what speed also. And you have to give time for truth to come. But I think that truth is a crucial point of all these processes.
And justice?
Justice. I was hoping you didn't emphasize that. There you have to, I don't know if that's the right word, but there you have to make an internal sort of deal, right? How much peace do you want to take, and how much justice are you willing to leave outside? No, I mean, there has to be a balance between how much justice you are willing to give, let's say. But this is a point in which Mark has much more expertise than I have.
Thank you for saying that, Alberto, but I think you covered the essential point just now. I mean, you know, look, a negotiation by its nature, structurally, is a space or a process requiring mutual concessions. So the question of what is the truth or who should be judged in a context in which there is violence in the backdrop, to take Alberto's earlier point about what kind of conflicts are we talking about here, and in which you have parties that do not have the ability to impose their will on the other, or impose their version of the facts on the other, or to impose justice even on the other. It's a negotiation. It will be messy. Today, I suppose what's a bit different is that international law, or perceptions of what international law does or does not allow, also impede what might otherwise be practical solutions that the parties might want to reach. It's a new factor. I mean, it's a new factor in the sense that the expectation today is that if there are truth and justice elements of the negotiated deal, and there may not be, but if that's been included, then the outside world and probably the citizens of the country, some of them will say, well, what does the law allow? What does our national law allow? What does international law allow? These are human rights questions. And so I think it's more complicated today, but I would say that we shouldn't always assume that in a negotiation that truth and justice will be visible, will be part of the negotiation. They may be too controversial precisely to include, and they may have to come later through a separate process, through a different democratic decision-making process or some other process, because they would act like dynamite on the negotiation itself. And maybe in the logic, as I said, of negative peace, maybe there will be places, and there have been historically across centuries, really millennia, where the price of peace is very high. And usually truth and justice are, historically would be sacrificed. But again, they're not sacrificed, hopefully, in an arbitrary way, but rather in a normative sense, that there's a higher and more immediate goal of ending violence that is paramount and that can only materialize if truth and justice are deferred to the future.
That's very interesting, because it turns around a little bit this ideal vision of negotiations that Mark was speaking about. So I was wondering, maybe quickly from both of you, in that sense, if truth and justice are not always the central things that should be pursued and so on, how do we, or rather, what can negotiating tables do, and the groups around it do to try to achieve what in Colombia they were calling the non-repetition of conflict, to make what was negotiated in some sense sustainable, even with a context in which conflicts, as Alberto was saying, could multiply, hopefully not violent ones.
It's interesting, Paul, that you bring this issue of repetition, especially being in Colombia. We will probably, many people would think, and they are right up to a certain point, that Colombia is the champion of repetition, right? And there we are again repeating and again and again. That's true, and that's also not true. It's important to make a difference. I mean, of course, some quick judgment would say, oh, we are back again. We're repeating the same thing. Someone can say that now in 2024, we are exactly the same, we're going back to 2013 or whatever, or 2013. It's true that there's lots of new violence, new groups, but it's also true that it's different. And it's not exactly repetition. If you look at things in detail, if you look at the dynamics that are happening now, it's different. No, it's only if you just look at the very big picture that you may think, oh, again, but no, not again. I mean, we're not back to what we were many years ago. And that's important to make that difference, because if we quickly decide that we are repeating again and nothing was achieved, which is it's against the facts. So I mean, there are lots of facts that show that we're not repeating. Colombia is a very different place. As I was saying in a discussion recently, maybe it's worse now, but it's not the same. right? The thing is moving. The type of conflict is different. The armed groups are different. It's a different dynamics. There are things that are not happening so much as they happened before. Others are beginning to increase. So it's important in that topic of repetition to have a more detailed and serious assessment of that, because if we don't do it, we can rush to conclusions that everything that was done in the past was wrong, and that can make you arrive to the wrong conclusion. So yeah, that's what I would like to say about that.
So we're getting close to the end. So I'll probably start asking you for your major sort of takeaways from this. But my own is I used to think of these negotiations as a solution to a problem. And as I hear you, it's much more like trying to shape the situation differently to first start stopping the most violence and then trying to see how to progress step by step, knowing that it's more like, let's try to move onto something that's less worse than it is at the moment. But perhaps I'm too pessimistic, and I'd really like to hear your conclusions.
Mark?
Sure. Okay, I'll go. I would say that you know, the point of negotiation minimally is to produce agreement on something. I mean, that's otherwise, what are you doing? And it's not only to produce an agreement, but an agreement that you have enough confidence in being implemented that, again, it is worth the effort. It is worth the costs. It is worth the risks that the different participants in the negotiation are very often taking. So I mean, the reason I say that is, I think we've reached a stage where, and maybe this goes back to something I said earlier, but maybe just to reiterate it since we're moving towards the close. But I think we have to get more practical in the way that we think about negotiation and the way that we practice negotiation, partly through developments in international law and international justice, partly because of the vindication of very important rights of participation that people who've maybe had been marginalized in society, you know, they've rightly demanded to be participants in a lot of spaces. But I don't think a negotiation space is the same as a democracy. It is not a parliament. It is not a forum of civil society. It should be a very narrow construction, a narrowly conceived, tightly conceived space, in my view, to produce the minimal result that it's built for, that it exists for, which is, again, to produce an outcome, an agreement, a settlement that can then be implemented to change something in reality. So negotiation should be designed for that above all. And if it's infused with too many ideals, if it is perhaps treated as an equivalent, in other words, if it becomes the place where unmet demands of groups in society are meant to be addressed, it's very easy to overburden and overweight the negotiation. And actually, it becomes a lose-lose scenario. It's a lose-lose scenario. And for whatever reason, series of reasons, I believe that we've landed there. The negotiation model that is taught everywhere, the guidelines that we have around the world teach on the basis of this mix of ideals and place the highest premium on the process itself. Who's there, how broad the agenda is, how transformative the process is. And it has basically become divorced too significantly, in my view, with the realities of conflict and with the logic of negotiation itself. That minimal primary goal, the raison d'etre of a negotiation, I think we've moved too far from that, and it produces failure in the vast majority of cases, and that's not good for ending conflict or even shrinking conflict. And so whatever that end goal is, shrinking or reducing or reshaping or resolving conflict, we need a model of negotiation that is far more realistic than the one that we have today, and that is purpose-built in part for speed. Because if it's not, I think we will see just an ever-increasing percentage of failed negotiations and a rise in conflict.
I agree that it's time to think of new paradigms of negotiation, new models, and that's why I welcome Mark's group effort in looking for that. And I think that one of the we should have put together the lessons learned, and one lesson that I would like to emphasize and take away is how important it is, besides all the other changes, to really understand that you have to be somehow emotionally prepared for a negotiation, and that preparation has basically to do with being in an attitude. It's a new attitude through which you are willing to change, to see new perspectives, to modify your point of view. If you look backwards on the history of failed negotiations or negotiations that are stuck somehow, I think that the common thing you would find in most of them is that nobody, or not the main actors at least of the group, were willing to change. They were willing to, their methodology was oriented to convince the other, to make the other person change, or the other group, or the other party, or the other whatever, and not an individual attitude of changing oneself. And this is important because this is something in practice I learned, and in our conversations with in the initial conversations with ELN, right? We kind of, both groups, we understood, and that's something that I like to hear that is said currently on both sides. The ELN leader said it, and the government leader also says it, that if we want to achieve something, we must all be willing to change somehow up to a certain point. And this is part of the pedagogy for the society, and this is something that we should be able to transmit to the people, to the group, and that there is a price to pay for all this that we want to achieve.
Thank you very much. This is a sort of deep philosophical lesson that first you have to change yourself if you want to be able to change the relation. Well, I mean, I'm so impressed of how people who are both scholars and invested in actual practice actually know more than us simple scholars. And so I would really like to thank you so much for this, and we'd hope to continue the conversation today. We have to finish this discussion, but I hope we'll have many opportunities to continue it. Séverine, perhaps you want to conclude?
Yes, so thank you very much, Mark and Alberto. So we'll continue our cycle. The next session will be with Sandrine Lefranc, who's a research director at the CNRS and a professor at Sciences Po Paris, and Sharon Vert, who's a lawyer and a professor at the American University of Paris. And they're both working about the link between justice and the courts and violence, and also on transitional justice. So the next session will be very interesting, I guess, and we'll pursue the exchange that we had today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A big pleasure.